Hey friends, welcome to another Skype session on Pints with Jack. Andrew Lazo here for another solo dip into some of the adventures that I've had in Lewis studies in the past. I'm actually joining you today after recording a session on letter 10 with Matt Bush. That was a great time. Today is November 22nd, 2020. It is the, 57th anniversary of Lewis's promotion to glory, and I'm recording at about 4 o'clock Eastern Time. Lewis died at 5:30 Greenwich Mean Time, and so just a few hours after his death. As I've mentioned on the podcast, and in the Skype session that I did with Matt Bush yesterday I received, and today I had blessed a beautiful icon by Christine Hales, and I commissioned her to do an icon of C.S. Lewis, and this is the result, and I'm really grateful for the chance to use this as a way to pray to the Lord and to remember the way that the particular qualities of Christ, some of the particular qualities of Christ were expressed in the life and the work and the loves of C.S. Lewis. And so I'm grateful for him today and grateful for the chance to join you. So as we're discussing the Screwtape Letters this year, I wanted to tell you about a remarkable experience I had a chance to partake in 2015. I spent the summer in New York City doing some work on Lewis and getting to know some Lewis folks. And while I was there, I actually was at the New York Public Library. I had a research fellowship, which sounds more prestigious than it actually is. There was certainly no money involved, but I got to have some space in the New York Public Library, and I did some work on Lewis there. And while I was there on the second floor, I applied for and got a permit to go upstairs to the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, where they actually have the manuscript of the Screwtape Letters. You may remember from Lewis's letters, he writes to Sister Penelope. He sends her the manuscript of the Screwtape Letters, and in some ways for safekeeping for World War II. And after the war, she said, "What should I do with it?" And he said, "Well, keep it for yourself, or see if you can sell it to some rich idiot." And the rich idiot that they sold it to is the New York Public Library. So I've actually held in my hands the actual handwritten script of the Screwtape Letters. These are about a page and a half of handwritten writing, what you have. And Lewis, as usual, wrote quickly, and he seemed to write without a whole lot of correction. So there aren't a whole lot of scratch outs and carrots and changes. The same I had a few years earlier when I transcribed Early Prose Joy. I transcribed it out of Lewis's hand, Lewis's first autobiography, the autobiography he wrote before he was even a Christian, but after he believed in God. This same autobiography that changed the date of Lewis's initial conversion to June of 1930. So I was familiar with the fact that Lewis wrote quickly. He wrote usually really well, and didn't make many changes. This is a great thrill. There were teacup stains on the actual manuscript, and it was fun to kind of have this manuscript in hand and to read through it and to see what Lewis actually said. So This was I only had one afternoon to spend some time with it, and I wasn't allowed to take any pictures, but these were the actual pages of the drafts of what would become the Screwtape Letters. And I took a number of notes, and I shared this file with David and Matt. And David contacted me last week and said, "Hey, we'd love for you to do a Skype session about the one textual emendation that I think is the most significant." So in order to kind of background this, you should probably pause this and go and pick up your Screwtape and read chapter 6, letter 6. And it's right near the end where he says, it's page 28 in my version. Think of your man, here's Screwtape talking about his patient. Think of your man as a series of concentric circles, his will being the innermost, his intellect coming next, and finally his fantasy. You can hardly hope at once to exclude from all the circles of everything that smells of the enemy, but you must keep on shoving all the virtues outward till they are finally located in the circle of fantasy, and all the desirable qualities inward into the will. It is only so insofar as they reach the will and are there embodied in habits that the virtues are really fatal to us. So there's two things that I want to talk about in terms of this. These 3 concentric circles, and we touched about it earlier in the podcast this year. Fantasy on the outside, intellect next, and the will at the center. So what you want to think about is, let's say, coming up from the new year, you decide, I need to get in shape. I want to improve my cardiovascular, aerobic exercise, and I want to get in shape. So here's what happens. I may have a fantasy that I would like to improve my heart health, and I would like to drop 20 pounds, and I would like to exercise for 25 minutes every day. That's a fantasy that I have on the outside. And then if I meet with my doctor and he said, hey, you need to watch your cholesterol, you need to improve your general health. When the intellect says, hey, that fantasy of dropping some weight and improving my health, that reaches the decision, the intellect, the place where I say, hey, it really makes sense. I need to care for these things. I mean, I use the example of health, but you can use the example of learning French or whatever else. I need to clean up this room. Wouldn't it be so great if I clean this room? Or I need to pray more, whatever. Fantasy on the outside, but it's not until the mind decides that it's important to you that those things can really start to happen. Now, I can have a fantasy of, getting in better health, and I can have the intellectual decision, hey, I need to do it. But it's not until it touches the will that any of those things are going to make a change. It's not until I join a gym and get some, workout gear and throw it in a bag and throw it in my car and get in the car and turn the key and drive to the gym and actually work out, and then to repeat it. We've talked about how action repeated becomes a habit, and habit repeated becomes a virtue. And action doesn't even happen until it goes from fantasy through the intellect and then touches the will. And once I decide to actually do something, that's when habit, action, virtue can begin to happen. So fantasy, intellect, will, habit, action, virtue. Does this make sense? I hope so anyway. And so I was really fascinated when I read about these series of concentric circles that this is what Lewis actually said in the original, and he crossed it out. He says, think of your man as a series of concentric circles, his will being the innermost. This is all the same. Now here's where the changes begin. His will being the innermost, his emotions coming next, then his intellect, and finally his fantasy. Okay, did you catch that? Will, emotions, intellect, fantasy. Now here's how the passage was originally constructed. Think of your man as a series of concentric circles, his will being the innermost, his emotions coming next, then his intellect, and finally his fantasy. So Lewis had 4 concentric circles with emotion being right next to will. And what he did was he crossed out emotions, inserted with a little caret, intellect, and then crossed out then his intellect. So here's how it originally read again. His will being the innermost, his emotions coming next, then his intellect, and finally his fantasy. So, Lewis had these 4 circles: will, emotion, intellect, fantasy. You may want to draw that out on a piece of paper. And then he changed it. So will still is the innermost, but then he crosses out emotion altogether and substitutes intellect and then fantasy. So he removes emotion and then he puts intellect. Now, I think it's way too easy, and I suggest that you do not do this. I don't think that you can just say, well, Lewis was dismissive of emotion, and he was unemotional. Certainly there is an aspect of that. Some of that is being raised in the UK and being told to keep a stiff upper lip. Some of that, I think, had a lot to do with how emotional his father was, and I think that Lewis certainly developed a distrust to a certain degree of emotion. Right? And this is, of course, written in 1941, 1942. Lewis removes emotion altogether, but I don't think anybody should say that Lewis was trying to obliviate emotion. So, but I think in terms of the development of virtue and in the action of becoming really human, for Lewis, emotion didn't play an integral part. Screwtape wanted Wormwood to see will, and then intellect, and then fantasy. What part emotion played, I'm not really sure. Don't dismiss Lewis. Don't dismiss emotion from Lewis's life. But I think in some ways, Lewis wasn't really willing to understand, explore, or kind of make a structure for the place of emotion until Joy Davidman came into his life and really helped to unlock Lewis's emotional side. Joy Davidman wrote a sonnet to him. She says to him, so this is Joy Davidman speaking of C.S. Lewis, "Oh, my great Antarctica, my newfound land of woman-killing frost." And so she found him as kind of this frozen, spiritual, intellectual person. And you can see by surprise in A Grief Observed that Joy Davidman in some ways really kind of reached into him and unfroze some of that Antarctica and made him really fully emotional. So he wasn't really sure what to do with emotions in 40, 41, 42. But I thought it was really interesting to see that originally it was fantasy, intellect, emotion, will, and then he removed it so it was just fantasy, intellect, will. In my opinion, as an emotional person, I think that this threefold model, 3 concentric circles, works a little bit better. But I wanted you to know that in his original thinking, he was already grappling with what place emotion had in the development of virtue, in the development of will, and how it all interacted. I think that there's some uncertainty. I think that he maybe added by subtraction, he simplified it. And I think that it was probably 10, 15 years later that he really became aware of how to deal with himself as an emotional person. And I think that it was Joy Davidman that really kind of helped him to do that. So just an interesting little note. You never know when this or that little bit of text can make all the difference. So in any case, I wanted to wish you a happy lesser feast of C.S. Lewis and blessings on your day. Pay attention to how your fantasy should lead to an intellectual decision, and that intellectual decision should lead to a repeated act of will that becomes a virtue. And let's follow Lewis in terms of the way that he developed virtue. Let's train up the habit of faith, and let's become virtuous people ourselves. God bless you.